In this module, we're going to work on adding order processing to the system. So users will have their shopping cart. It's already got items in it. We need a way to let them check out and create an order. So first thing we're going to do is add a separate module just for order processing. I'm going to add this by hand so you'll be able to see everything that's involved. But as we add additional modules, I'll probably go a little bit faster since you'll already get the idea. Next, because the cart is in the users module and we have a new order processing module, somehow these two need to communicate. So we have a couple of choices. We could create a new order endpoint on order processing and have the cart in the user interface just post to that endpoint. The thing I don't like about that is that we can't really trust anything that gets posted to us. And so I really want to get the cart that's already been verified, that's already in persistence inside of the users module. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to post to the cart endpoint that's in the users module and say check out, and then that is what's going to trigger the creation of the new order. Now the benefit of that for learning purposes is that we're going to see how those two modules can communicate in order to do that, because we're triggering the action in one module, but most of the work is going to have to take place in the other. The other thing that checkout is going to need is addresses. So we're going to need to know where to ship these books and a billing address as well, although we're not doing payments at the moment. So those are going to need to be added to the users module, and then we're going to pass those IDs of those addresses along with the shopping cart in order to create the order. Now, since we're only going to pass the IDs with the request to create a new order, we're going to need a way for the order module to get the address information. And so we're going to implement a materialized view so that the order module doesn't have to ask the user module for every single address it gets. Now, as I already mentioned, this isn't as critical in a modular monolith because there's not really that much overhead in having the orders module get the data directly from the users module. But in a microservice type of situation, this materialized view would be very helpful. And so we're going to see how to set it up. Now, it's one thing to create the materialized view, but then you also need some mechanism for updating it. So we'll look at that as well. And then once we've done this, we're going to have a fair bit of complexity in these projects. So we're going to want to refactor them, add a little bit more structure, and we're going to apply the clean architecture approach to these modules. Clean architecture is all about keeping dependencies away from infrastructure concerns like the database. And the way that you can usually enforce that in a solution structure is through the use of different projects and structuring your project dependencies in such a way that your domain classes cannot depend on your infrastructure types because there's a project dependency going the other way. Now, in a modular monolith, we're going to be using a bunch of different projects for each module, and everything that module needs, its API endpoints, its data, its domain objects, is all inside of that one class library. So we can't necessarily use the same approach. We could break it up into even more projects, but since our modular monolith already has quite a few projects by virtue of the fact that it's modular, I prefer to just use something like archunit.net to enforce some of these rules if we're going to use clean architecture inside of one of these modular monolith classes. It also makes it easier for these types that we're using to stay internal, because if we start to have multiple projects within a module, we'll have to make things public. And once they're public, we can't say they're only public to that module. They'll be public to the entire solution. And that'll make it much easier for different modules to depend on things they shouldn't in other module libraries. And then before we're done with this module, I just want to show one additional pattern that's very helpful, and that is going to be the chain of responsibility pattern. So we'll see how that can help clean up some cross-cutting concerns inside of the application. All right, let's jump into Visual Studio and get started. Okay, so to add a new module, the first thing we're going to do is add a new solution folder. And then we're going to add a new class library project. Since we're going to be creating orders, I think the first thing we can start with is what our order domain model is going to look like. And we're just going to give it a few properties like an ID that's going to be a GUID. We're going to have a billing address and shipping address, and we're going to also have a set of order items, which are going to come from the shopping cart items. Now we haven't actually defined the address type or the order item type yet, but we will get there in just a minute. It'll also be nice to know when the order was created and to be able to add items to it, which is really all we need at this point. We're not going to worry about being able to update or delete items. For the order items, we're just going to want basically the same things we have on a cart. So that means we need the book ID, a quantity, a unit price, and some description just so we can list that on the order. And then for address, we just need essentially a value object. We'll just use a record. And it will include the streets, city, state, postal code, country information. And for the order item, we're going to go ahead and give it a constructor and make sure all of the things that it takes in are in a valid state. And for that, we're going to use our Dallas guard clauses once again. I'm just going to steal some references from the users module. I'm not sure if we're going to need all these things, but we can come back and clean them up later if we need to. Now we'll just move these to their own files. All right, now we've got our basic domain model for order in place. The other thing we're going to want to have for any module is something that wires up its services. So we're going to copy that from the users module. And while we're here, we're going to just rename this to be service extensions and make sure that these are all named consistently with one another. We look in here, we want to make sure each one of these calls is the same. Add book services, add user module services. Let's make this book module services just for consistency. And then we're going to add the order processing module services. Copy this up into here and then just rename it. Now we are going to need a DB context and connection string for order processing. So we're basically just going to modify this to apply to order processing instead of users. We're probably going to have an iOrder repository, so we'll just put that in here now. And of course, we'll have an EF implementation. I'm sure we'll be using mediator, so we'll add this assembly to the mediator things to search for handlers, and then we'll specify that the order processing module services were registered. All right, so that means we need to create a DB context, an interface, and an implementation. We're going to, again, just steal some things from user. So over here, we've got a user's DB context. We'll start with that. And the main thing we want to track is orders. Now we want to make sure our schema is going to be orders, or actually order processing. And that's all we need for the DB context. So that one's good. Now we need the interface and implementation. We don't need all the possible operations. All we really need to be able to do is add the order. We'll probably want to be able to get a list of orders, and then of course we'll need to be able to save things. And then our implementation is going to be pretty straightforward. Just going to delegate to the DB context for each one of the things. Put these in their own files. All right, now we're going to need to create some migrations, but before we do that, we're going to want some configuration classes. So let's configure our orders and order items. All right, so we're going to create identity type configurations for order and order item. And because we want the address data to stay on the same record as the order, we're going to configure those as complex properties in Entity Framework Core. So here on line 14, we're going to say builder.complexProperty of shipping address, and then we're going to define all of its properties in terms of how wide those columns should be, using this lambda. Now, I'm using some constants for these values, which we'll just throw into a constants file, just so we don't have a bunch of magic numbers. And you can see we have billing address and shipping address, both of which are configured the same way. Our order item configuration is much simpler. We're just going to specify the ID and how long the description field is. And in this case, I am using a magic number, but there's only one of them. And if we had a bunch of those, we'd pull them out into a constant. All right, now we're ready to drop into PowerShell and create our migrations. All right, we need to go into the web project. And then from the web project, we're going to create our migration. And we're going to output the results into the data migrations folder. All right, we do need to add a project reference from web to order processing. So we forgot that. And while we're at it, let's make sure we load up the order processing services here. Let's try this again. Looks like it worked. Now we have a data folder with migrations with our initial order migration. Next, let's go ahead and apply it to the database. We're going to need to make sure we have our connection string, order processing, which should match what we have here, order processing connection string. Let's make sure our file name matches. There we go. And do the database update. And it looks like it worked. The last thing we're going to do is create the endpoint that's going to list the orders, just so we have some way to verify once we start checking out carts that we can see that those orders were created. All right, this will just be listing on the orders endpoint, and it needs a list orders for user response type to be defined. So let's just create that real quick. And all this is going to have is a list of orders. We want to have a DTO that represents those orders. Let's call it order summary. And that order summary can be pretty simple. For our needs, we don't really even need to see all the details of the individual items. It'll be enough for us to just see the total and the dates when it was created, maybe when it was shipped. All right, so we can move these to their own files. Now we're ready to set up the endpoint. We'll grab the email address and we'll use that to look up their orders. We're going to use Mediator for this so that we'll have a use case that corresponds to this, and it's going to have a query, and that's going to be listing the orders. So we need to inject Mediator, and we need to define this query. It needs to take in a string email address, and it needs to be a Mediator type. We're going to have it return a list of order summaries. But we want to also know if anything goes wrong, so we're going to wrap that in a result type. All right, that's our whole record. Now, of course, we're going to want to handle that somewhere. We'll leave that aside for a moment. Let's finish up with the endpoint. When we send that email address, it's going to check and see if it can find a user ID that goes with that email address. And if it can't, then it's going to send an unauthorized result back. And we'll just pass that along as our response. Otherwise, for the happy path, when everything works, we're going to just create our response object and map the data that we get into it. All right, that should do the trick. Move this to its own file, and we need to create its handler. This needs to implement the mediator interface iRequestHandler and specify the type of the query as well as the response. All right, we're going to leave a few things out for now just to make this a little quicker, but we're going to grab the orders, we're going to map them to summaries, we're going to return the summaries. And normally in a list async, I wouldn't include any other properties, but in order to make everything work easily here, I'm going to go ahead and do that right now. A better way to do this would be to use a specification, which we may have time to show later in the course, but if not, check out our dallas.specification for a much more flexible way to work with repositories like this. Now we're ready to test to see if this endpoint works or if it blows up. First thing we'll need to do is log in. And then we should be able to list the orders, and there aren't any yet. That's what we expect, but it didn't blow up, which is good. That means all of the dependencies are wired up correctly. If you look at the output for the web project, you can see that it loaded up all of the different modules, and here it's making what look to be the correct queries to get all the order information. All right, now we just need to actually set up the checkout endpoint on cart so that we can create the order, and then we'll see that in our list. All right, the way we're going to do this is we're going to use mediator to send a command to the order processing module. So we've got our endpoint. It's going to take in a request. It's going to return a response. It's going to require an email address, so it will only work if the user is authenticated. Inside, we're going to go find that user's email address, use that to create a command. It's going to include the email address as well as the shipping and billing address IDs. We're going to send that and see what type of result we get. Assuming that it's not a failure result, then we're going to say everything was okay. All right, since we're getting the email address from the user's authentication, our request just needs to have the address IDs. And then our response can just provide the order ID of the created order. All right, now we just need to create the command, which we'll do inside the order processing module. And for things that communicate between modules, we want to have a folder called integrations, just so it's obvious that that's where any communication with other modules takes place. Now inside of integrations is where the handler for the command will live, but we don't want to allow a direct reference on the order processing module from the user's module. So the way we're going to avoid that is by introducing a new class library, which is going to be order processing.contracts. So the create order command, which lives in order processing.contracts, needs to know the user ID that's creating the order. It needs to know the address information, and it needs the list of order items. We're going to use a separate DTO for that, which will also be defined in this same library. Then, of course, we'll have to add references to NuGet packages for mediator and our Dallas.result. And then the order details response just needs to have a GUID for the order ID. We just put these in their own files. Now we just need to add project references so that the checkout handler can reference that contracts file. Now, even though we've added a reference to riverbooks.orderprocessing.contracts, this command is actually a local command that should be defined inside the use cases for users. So we need to create a use case for checkout, and that's going to include this checkout cart command. We'll also need a handler for this, and this is the one that's going to actually go and create the create order command and pass that on to the order processing module. All right, so inside of this handler, we're going to go look up the user with their cart. If they're null, we're going to return unauthorized. Otherwise, we're going to take all of their cart items and pull it into the items that we need, which is the order item details. Then we're going to create that create order command, and we're going to pass it in the shipping addresses and the items. Then we're going to make a synchronous call with mediator to send that command, and it's going to hit the handler in the order processing module immediately and then return back whatever result it gets. If the result is not successful, we're going to use result.map to just return back whatever the non-successful result is, and to just map it to a result of GUID and let it pass along whatever that non-successful result might be. And then we're going to clear the cart, which we'll implement in just a second, and then save the changes, and then we'll return success with that order ID. So let's just go implement this, and all we have to do is clear out the cart items. All right, so now everything is done on the user side of things. We just need to implement this handler to create the order in the order processing module. The create order command handler is going to be another mediator handler. And in order to have access to its command, we need to make sure that the order processing library has a reference to the order processing contracts library. We're going to need our iOrder repository to save the new order. We'll map the items into order items in our domain, then we're ready to create the order. Now later on, we're going to want to be able to create domain events whenever an order is created. And so rather than just newing it up here and then trying to figure out how to create the domain event from within this integration, it's often useful to have a factory for creating your domain types. So we're going to create a factory class. We're going to put it inside the order class, and it's going to be responsible for actually instantiating the order and later on adding that domain event. Now you may wonder why we're putting this inside of the order class. The reason is that this factory as a nested class can actually access all the private setters and properties on order. So with this factory method in place, now we can jump back to our handler and call it. All right, now we have everything in place to create the order, except that we don't actually have the address data yet. So for now, we're just going to set these to fake values. Great, now we can build. Let's go ahead and see if we can hit that checkout endpoint. Now remember, our checkout endpoint is expecting a shipping address ID and a billing address ID. So we're going to have to pass those. We're also going to need a way to add addresses at some point. For now, since we're not actually using these IDs, we can just pass any GUID and it should be fine. One last thing before we're done, let's add a logger to say that we created this order. All right, so that worked as soon as we added the content type that we'd forgotten. And we can see that the new item created was logged. Now we just want to see if we can see the order. And when we list the orders, you can see that it's right there. All right, so that was a lot to get all that communication and coordination happening from cart checkout, firing off a command, and having that handler in the brand new order processing module take care of that and actually persist the order in its own separate data store. All of that is now working. In the next section, we're going to figure out how to get that address data. We're going to need to capture addresses in the user module and then get them from the order processing module.